A centurion is a Roman soldier in charge of 100 others. A century. All right, you guys are in the middle of your discussion, but I think it would be helpful to get moving a little bit. We'll see how much of chapter 8 we can cover tonight. Loretta asked just about what a centurion is, and you all know Roman military formations, right? Roman military, you gotta learn some things. You all have to, you should learn a lot about the Bible, but you should go home and watch a video about Roman military formation. Very important. So a centurion is in charge of a century. There, where we get all these English words from, and it means in charge of 100. And centuries were organized into cohorts, and cohorts were organized into legions. And a legion had, when it was at full strength, close to 6,600 soldiers. The Romans were one of the first countries that fielded a professional army at the scale that they did. Lots of other countries, men would come to form an army from various walks of life. The Romans actually had a professional one. And there's all kinds of things that they were really good at. You know, one of the funny things that psychologists have noted is, like, women are constantly planning their weddings until they get married, and men think about, like, Roman military stuff. Like, that's a thing. You could find, like, you would think that these young bucks at high school know nothing, and you start talking to them about Roman military stuff and their ears perk up. It's way more exciting than you're giving it credit for, Anne. Come on.
All right.
Roman military formations.
I'm going to be checking it out tonight.
It's actually quite extraordinary what they were able to accomplish. Like, many of their roads were done by the military. They built lots of aqueducts. One of the problems that the Romans had is, once they were good at fighting, they didn't really lose very often, and so they had to figure out what to do with them. And they're always sort of making them run around the empire and do something, because if you leave them somewhere too long, guess what happens? They either all start fighting each other, or they all start fighting you. Neither of which you want to happen. So, the best way to make sure that they don't is to constantly move them around to other places and do other things. I'm not sure. As a priest, I've never gotten into a fight with someone with swords and shields, but I could try. Has it happened? I don't. Not in my memory. It would be a little bit frowned upon by the Code of Canon Law today. I'm not sure they would know what to do with you if you took out a sword and shield and started attacking people. That doesn't really fit into what priests are supposed to do. It's not part of the job description. That's a good modern answer. I'm not going to do it. It's not part of my job description. When Jesus comes down, so the Sermon on the Mount, the Gospel of Matthew, one of the things that is easy to miss is the structure and the flow of it. So we have a beginning. It has a chapter about the beginning of the life of Jesus, some stuff about Bethlehem, those kind of things. It talks about Joseph a little bit. They head down to Egypt. They come back. In chapter 2, we had his baptism. I think that's at the end of chapter 1 or the beginning of chapter 2. Jesus' baptism in the Jordan. He goes out into the desert. He's tempted by Satan, and we have that temptation narrative. He comes back, he calls his first disciples, he does a little bit of stuff, and then he starts preaching this giant sermon. And that starts in chapter 5 and goes 5, 6, 7. That whole thing is like an extended sequence. And then Jesus, this talks about like coming down the mountain. And what would logically make sense in the story for any ordinary person is, let's say, this is taking it too literally, but let's say you were up preaching on the mountain for a few days, you would come down and you would rest, because that would seem like a normal thing to do. And it's the exact opposite of what Jesus does. When he comes down the mountain, he sort of launches into his mission with gusto. Now, this is probably part of the gospel that's, how do we say, like the narrative is constructed. That doesn't mean it's false, but it's a constructed narrative. You know, Jesus we're into chapter 8, has done no sleeping so far. Jesus has done very little eating so far. And he was a man like us in all things but sin, so he must have slept at some point. I mean, even if we allow for him going on little sleep, he must have slept at some point. You know, if the Sermon on the Mount was something that was extended over several days, it's very possible that he slept in the middle of it. You know, there's a lot that we don't know. And so in the flow of the narrative, what you experience is this kind of dynamic movement that Jesus is in a hurry to launch into his mission. And that may very well be true. But it is also like the narrative function of the text, like it's what it's portraying Jesus doing. You know, if the priest at the church here was preaching for 3 days, y'all would say, "Okay, Father, shut up, it's time for breakfast." I mean, yeah, you want to go on your mission, that's fine, but we're going to eat breakfast first. That kind of thing. Unless you're going fishing, then maybe you go fishing first. But Jesus comes down, and the narrative reveals him to be very much a man of action. He is ready to act and ready to move in the world. And he launches into this program, and it's a little bit easy to miss the link here, but it's actually a pattern that's laid out in the book of Isaiah. If you look at the Gospel of Matthew, like Jesus starts his preaching in the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. And you might say, you might not recall knowing those very well, but you've heard the passage 1,000 times. Land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those areas of the world are on the northeast side of the Sea of Galilee. They were the first tribes to go into exile. And you'll recall, I hope, hearing Jesus talk about how a good shepherd goes after the lost sheep. So what is Jesus doing? The house of Israel has gotten lost. They've given into idolatry. They've been lost on this path. And so Jesus goes out to seek them and to find them. And he starts in the regions that got lost first. So he follows this entire paradigm, this entire pattern, like what the Messiah is supposed to do is laid out in the book of Isaiah. When the Messiah comes, he will free the captives, he'll bring sight to the blind, he'll cleanse our illnesses. Like that whole thing is almost word for word and line by line the story of Isaiah, which by this time was likely written close to 800, 900, 1,000 years before the time of Christ. Well, maybe not quite that far. I think Isaiah is after David. David was about 1,000 years before Christ. Isaiah would have been in the time of the Assyrian exile, which is Assyrian conquest of northern Israel. We've talked about this many times.
Give us a hint.
722 BC. 722 BC is the Assyrian exile. That's the time of the prophet Isaiah. It was on the tip of Russ's tongue. He was going to beat you to it. So 700 years, give or take, 750 years before this point in the life of Jesus. It talks about him teaching, it talks about him performing these mighty deeds, these miracles. Maybe I have the book here. So let's look at the beginning of chapter 8, and we're going to find, what do we find at the beginning of chapter 8? When Jesus came down the mountain, here it is. It's not quite at the very beginning, but in verse 17, to fulfill what had been said by Isaiah the prophet, he took away our infirmities and bore our diseases. Is that the only line they give us? That's not the whole quote. Where's the rest of it? Okay, I guess we'll have to look it up later. It's in the book of Isaiah. I'm quite sure. But Jesus is coming to cast out evil. This is one of the other things. You know, there's this great line that we're going to get to in chapter 16 about how the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, against Peter and his confession of faith. You use gates to keep people out. The Gospels portray Jesus as launching an invasion. Jesus isn't like setting up territory to defend. He's invading something. He's invading land that was taken away from the Lord that, you know, Satan is kind of claiming dominion over after the fall of humanity. Jesus is launching an invasion. It's a helpful thing to realize that he is coming not just to like set up and build a wall and build a fortress to keep bad things out. He's actually coming to claim those who are lost so that they're found again. Jesus is coming to find people. And the story of the Gospel of Matthew is going to do this by introducing us to 10 miracle stories. The first 5 of them happen in chapter 8. The second 5 will happen at the beginning of chapter 9. And then there's 2 interruptions in it. So there's one interruption about calling and discipleship. I know that's one. I feel like is the second one. I'm not sure what the second one is. Second one must come in chapter 9. But the first one is this kind of unique moment of calling and discipleship when the scribe, I think it's a scribe and a Pharisee, want to follow him, and he kind of says no, and he sounds like he's being rude. A scribe and a 2 want to follow him conditionally. Maybe we'll make it all the way there.
Question.
Sure.
So there's a 1,000 years different before Christ came between when David was ruling.
Mm-hmm. David's reign, kind of by tradition, but by history it's really, really close, is held to have started in 1000 BC.
See, I thought that was only like about a couple hundred years.
No, there were 1,000 years in there.
Oh my gosh.
There's really, really strange things though. Like, I like a lot of the ancient history stuff. So the first major culture in the world that became a civilization we call the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamian civilization. You guys got to work on world history. They're called the Sumerians. The Sumerians, the height of their civilization, or a number that's easy to remember, is around 3500 BC. They built the city of Ur, the Chaldeans, where Abraham's from. That city was like a couple thousand years old when Abraham left it. And what's really, really crazy, to give you a perspective of how crazy history is, in the time, like, we are closer to the time of Jesus than Jesus is to the construction of the Great Pyramid.
Yeah.
And then Jesus is to the Sumerians. There would be another 1,500 years between the Sumerians and Jesus. There's 3,500 years in there. We're only 2,026-ish years from Jesus.
So before Christ, what did the people believe?
Well, some of them were Jewish, so some of them are following like biblical Judaism. There's lots of other religions, and a lot of the religions are a wee bit strange. Most of them were pagan. Almost all of them were pagan. Some of them pagan in several different ways. Places had different gods. The Sumerians had their own gods. I could tell you the story about a lot of them, but then we'd never get anywhere.
I'm sorry I got you.
No, it's okay. It's a great question. And I think it just helps you appreciate, like, there's more time that's passed than we give it credit for. Like, for instance, we're closer to the end of the Middle Ages than Jesus was to David.
Yeah, by far.
Like the end of the Middle Ages, you can put in the late 1200s, early 1300s, depending on the dating. The next time period after the Middle Ages is we're going to work on history. It's called the Renaissance.
You could give us multiple choice.
That's what my students always say, and then they think my multiple choice are worse than my essays.
But we have more memory problem than your students.
You think that's true. I can promise you their ability to forget things is amazing. It's almost miraculous.
In grade school,
By
wasn't there a
choice?
class
By
of
choice or
ancient
what?
Sometimes you wonder. You definitely wonder. But Jesus, I would encourage you to look up some of the ancient history. There's a ton of fun stuff you can find. One of the great podcasts of the world is called The Fall of Civilizations. And they spend like hours going through these things. You can listen to the one about the Persians is really good. It's called the Achaemenid Empire. That was founded by Cyrus the Great, who sent the Jews home in 539 BC. You can listen to the one about the Mongols and the rise of Genghis Khan in the 1200s and how they conquered things. He's another really interesting guy. They're hours. They're great to listen to. I would encourage. It's great bedtime reading. Great bedtime listening. No, you're reading this in the morning when your brain is working really well.
No, mine takes half a day to wake up.
With a cup of coffee.
So Jesus comes down the mountain. He's going to launch into these miracles. And what is important to see is it's comparing him to Moses. Now the comparison should be a little bit strange because Moses goes up on the mountain, receives the 10 Commandments from God, and what does he encounter when he comes down?
Corruption, yeah. The golden
Yep,
cow.
the golden calf. When he comes down, he encounters the golden calf. And that's when there's a lot of death and destruction and there's problems in Israel. Now, Jesus is going to come down. You could think of him like coming down to a world that's also very lost, like the people were at the time of the golden calf. And Jesus is going to sort of enter into it and begin to change it. Jesus doesn't go alone. He brings people with him. One of the exciting parts about him is that he's not just in it for himself. He's not just a healer, but he's bringing his apostles along. He's training them in this mission. And he's going to act completely differently than their teachers of the past have, than scribes of the past have. Because Jesus isn't just going to stand on the mountain and preach, he's going to actually go out and heal. And I think maybe this is a good image for you to sit with in the coming week, is just the dynamism, the life of this. Sometimes I think in our faith, we start to imagine Jesus as passive, as standing back, as like the God in heaven who is a bit disconnected from earth and disconnected from me and disconnected from my problems. And one of the beautiful pieces when you look at the scripture passage in particular, at the beginning of chapter 8, is Jesus is very dynamic. He's like going out to seek and to save the lost. And that's not just he's saying that, he's like physically going to them and picking them up off the ground and curing their illnesses and sending them on their way. And then he goes and he picks up the next person. And I think that like that kind of thing, when we talk about Jesus as God, when we talk about what we worship, when we talk about receiving Holy Communion, you know, like there's this movement now to talk about evangelization and discipleship, and those sound like big words, but we're really following the pattern of Christ. Like it's in the scriptures. This is what he does. You know, that he doesn't just stay in a church and preach, that he actually physically goes out and picks them up. There's beauty to that. And the people that he goes to are the most surprising ones. Like I said, so he's following this paradigm of Isaiah. He's going to seek and to save the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And the first person that he finds is a leper who's sort of kicked out of the house of Israel. because of his disease. Now, some of that was mandated by the Old Testament, but just keep that in mind. Like, you would think that the story, if he's going to save the lost sheep of the house of Israel, he should find an Israelite and save them. But he's going to talk about how the children of the kingdom, the people that were supposed to be part of the party, left it and walked away, and the people that weren't supposed to be are going to come in and enjoy it. It's this paradigm about this change that God called the Jewish people to himself, to be his own, to be a particular people in the world, and many of them eventually drifted away. And so God began to call the Gentiles, because the plan from the very beginning was actually to include the Gentiles, the people that weren't Jewish. That got lost a little bit in history. But when Jesus goes to preach to the Gentiles, what happens? They actually open their hearts. Yes. And so this is the irony, that the people who should be most interested should be the children of Israel, and by and large in the gospel they're not going to be. And the people that should be least interested are the Gentiles, and they're going to be chomping at the bit to have Jesus come and visit them. The Jews are sometimes going to throw him out. So, leprosy, it's a bacterial disease. It was diagnosed by the priest. People who had it were exiled from the community. It made people unclean. And one of the problems in the Bible is that as time went on, there became this connection that was made between being ritually unclean, which meant that you had to be cleansed before you could take part in offering temple sacrifices and those things, and being morally unclean, like having done something bad. Those two wires get crossed, and they get crossed in a big way. And you can see it in leprosy. So someone who's unclean because of leprosy, and they were pronounced unclean, is ritually unclean. But because stuff gets mixed up, they're treated as if they were also morally unclean. And Jesus definitely wants to separate those. All kinds of things led to being unclean. If you got a paper cut in Jewish world, you're unclean until sundown, and you have to cleanse it in water, and there's a procedure to become clean again. But blood was something that made you unclean. And that was a regular, there's oftentimes no sin in getting a paper cut. You're not like, I'm going to viciously attack my finger with this paper and cut it. No, you don't do that. There's no sin involved. But if you have those two things confused, if ritual uncleanness becomes moral uncleanness, and those are together, then, if you're ritually unclean, then you're morally unclean. And you can't make sense out of the Jewish treatment of the woman with the hemorrhage until you realize how crossed those two wires were. Jesus' point is that one of his points is that ritual uncleanness doesn't matter a whole lot. It was given to them for a time. So uncleanness becomes tied to immorality. Judaism required people with leprosy to live apart. They had to live on their own. I think eventually they have to carry a bell and shout unclean when they come. And part of it was probably to prevent the spread of the disease. Leprosy doesn't spread super easily, but it does spread. It's a bacterial disease, so you can treat it with a modern antibiotic, but they didn't know about bacteria back then. But there's power in this story, because in so many ways, some of the layers of it. So on one layer, there is the leper who meets Jesus, and Jesus and his compassion who comes out to meet the leper. Jesus isn't afraid. He's not bothered by his uncleanness. In him, holiness radiates out. It changes people who come into contact with him. And so there's beauty to that. There's beauty to that layer. But there's a lot more to it. Because in some ways, all of us and our sin make us like lepers. There's parts of our heart where we feel like we are unclean, where we feel like we are rejected because of what we've done. Sometimes we start to feel kind of rejected and left out. Sometimes it's areas in our heart that we're afraid of, like the thing that we most want to hide, where we have cast out like part of our lives or part of our history. And this is a story about Jesus coming to transform something broken and make it whole again. And so there's a layer where you can look at it as the leper and the compassion of Jesus in the face of Christ. There's a layer where you can look at it as your own heart and the things that you and I try to cast out and hide and run away from, the things that we exile out of our own hearts. And it can become a story about Jesus wanting to meet that part of us as well, of wanting to bring healing and restoration there. In this story, one of the beautiful things that's really easy to miss in English is the leper comes up, and most English translations will say something like he bows down before Jesus. And it uses a much more technical word here. It uses the word proskunesin. Proskune means to prostrate oneself. It's actually an act of worship. It's an act that you would give to God, sometimes to a king, but to God. Like you bow down and prostrate yourself before God. We don't have the same sense today of the physicality of religion that they had back then. You see it in Islam. In Islam, when they do their prayers on the mat, they have to bow down with their head and touch the ground, and then like kneel up and bow down and kneel up, and like that kind of stuff. But that's kind of what it's talking about, that this man like physically throws himself on the ground in front of Jesus, and it's not like he just flops down like he tripped over a rock, but it's a gesture of reverence. And he's the only one in the story that does it. You see, again, there's this great irony. The Gospels are just kind of dripping with it, because Jesus is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, and he would rightfully deserve worship from his people. And the one who bows down before him is the leper, the one who is sick, the one who is seeking healing, not all of those that think they're clean. So even the disciples, in a sense, are sort of, you would imagine them kind of standing next to Jesus, and it's the leper who throws himself down. That's another beautiful dimension of this story. The leper doesn't wait. This is one of the other things. Can we reach a point in our heart where even when we have struggles, and even when we have failures, and even when we have difficulties, we're unwilling to wait? We seek out Jesus. That's a beautiful thing. Jesus chooses to physically touch the leper. And again, I think it's really hard to appreciate just how profound this is. Lepers were unclean. They had to stay away from people. So it's very possible that this leper, if he's a man, has not had very much for human contact and human touch in years. And before Jesus says anything to him, he reaches out to touch him. I think there's something profoundly beautiful in that. And I would encourage you to imagine this scene. What is it like for Jesus to reach out and touch him? Let yourself paint that in your mind. What is it for Jesus to reach into your heart and touch these parts that you don't want anyone to see? What is it? How does Jesus approach us with love and compassion? What does that really look like? Sometimes love and compassion actually looks like confronting darkness. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a person is say, this is not the way to heaven. Sometimes that's what we need. Sometimes it is actually helpful to have the drill instructor who kind of kicks you in the butt and says, hey, get going. Sometimes you need gentleness, and sometimes you need someone who reaches down and looks into your eyes and holds your hand and doesn't push very hard. And that's okay. Those kind of things are okay. But there is this beautiful image of the leper touched by Christ. And again, he does this before he says anything. And then the leper calls him Lord. I forget if this translation uses sir for him. Did him homage.
Is that?
This is, well, the one that it has in the bold text is the New American Bible, the Revised New American Bible that we use in the liturgy. This one keeps Lord. Sometimes they'll translate it sir. I think it's better Lord because it's the word from the burning bush. If you wish, you can make me clean. This is where, this is this part. Jesus stretched out his hand, touched him, and said, I do will it. Be made clean. But it's easy to miss that gesture of Christ reaching out to touch him first. And I think there's something beautiful about that. We're, I think, far too ready to speak sometimes and not ready enough to respond with empathy or compassion. Brian?
In the military, an officer doesn't call somebody underneath him sir. You always say sir to someone that's elevated and has more power.
You could, yes. And there's ways. The word that's used here is kurios, and you can translate it sir, but a biblical Jew can't translate it sir because kurios is what you call God. They have other words that they'll use for a human person. And, so what is the sense of the Greek here? It's hard to say because the Greeks do use it as a term for sir. But I think the way that Jesus responds to him, it would be better translated like the New American does here as Lord. Translations have this thing about significantly weakening the impact of the text sometimes. Like I was saying before with the prostration part, we just miss the depth of meaning to that in English. This would be like the kind of bowing down that you would do, if someone had been lost for 2 decades and came off a ship and you were waiting for them and you're overwhelmed with emotion. Like you might use that kind of word there. Like you were sort of thrown onto the ground because you couldn't stand in their presence. Like it's a reunion, it's love, it's that kind of thing. And I guess as I've been through the scriptures more and more, it's kind of stuck in my heart. Like, I think it's better in a lot of cases to try and convey the original sense of these words, because you can certainly translate it accurately in some of the ways that they do, but it's much easier to miss in the other direction what is very possible, that it's not just calling him sir, that it's actually calling him Lord, and the guy means God. There's times in the life of Jesus where people will call him Lord or sir in English, and he responds as if they did something utterly astounding. And it doesn't really make sense if he called him sir, because that's what you do for everyone, basically. Yes, sir, no, sir, those kind of things. And so Jesus' reaction doesn't make sense at all. But if you think of him as using like God, then it's different. I mean, one of the titles, for instance, that Jesus is most sensitive about is when he gets called Son of David. We think of Jesus as a son of David, and it's just sort of like another name. But Son of David, if you're a Jew, means like you are the rightful king of Israel.